Your file name is just a human-friendly mask. To Linux, a file is an inode number. Think of the inode as the social security number for a file. It stores the metadata, size, owner, permissions, timestamps, and the data blocks where the actual content lives on the disk. Crucially, the inode does not store the file name. The file name lives in a directory file, which is just a list of names mapped to inode numbers. This is why hard links exist. You can have 5 different file names in 5 different folders, all pointing to the exact same inode. The file isn't deleted until the link count hits 0. How does Linux treat a hardware mouse, a text document, and a network socket the same way? Through the VFS. It's a giant abstraction layer in the kernel. When you run a command like read, you don't care if the data is on an SSD, a spinning hard drive, or a network-mounted drive in another country. The VFS acts as a universal interface. It sits above the specific file systems and translates your generic request into the specific driver language needed. Without VFS, every app you wrote would need custom code just to talk to different brands of hard drives. When you hit the power button, your CPU is dumb. It doesn't even know your OS exists. First, UEFI wakes up and looks for a boot entry. It finds GRUB, the Grand Unified Bootloader. GRUB's job is to load the kernel and the initramps into memory. The initramps is a tiny compressed file system that contains just enough drivers to mount your actual hard drive. Once the kernel is uncompressed and running, it kills the bootloader and starts PID1. If you've ever been stuck in a GRUB rescue loop, it's usually because your sticker, the path to the kernel, fell off the drive. In the old days of Linux, we used sysvinit, which started services one by one in a specific order. If one service hung, the whole boot hung. System changed everything by using socket activation. It creates the communication sockets for all services immediately, and then starts the services in parallel. It is PID1, the parent of every process on your machine. People call it bloatware because it now handles logging, networking, and even hardware. But its efficiency is why your modern Linux server can reboot in seconds. Processes don't have a UI to talk to each other. They use signals. These are tiny notifications sent by the kernel. When you hit Control-C, you're sending SIGINT. Most apps catch this signal. Save your work and close gracefully. Control-Z sends SIGSTOP, which freezes the process in RAM until you send SIGCONT. But then there's sigkill, the hammer. Sigkill cannot be ignored or caught by the app. The kernel simply stops giving that process CPU cycles and wipes its memory. It's the digital equivalent of an executioner. This is what makes Docker possible without using a heavy virtual machine. Namespaces provide isolation. They wrap a process so it thinks it has its own private network, its own list of users, and its own root directory. It's like putting a process in a sensory deprivation tank. cgroups provide resource limiting. They act like a meter, ensuring a process can't use more than, say, 512 megabytes of RAM, or 10% of your CPU. When you combine isolation with metering, you have a container. RAM is a finite resource, but Linux is an optimist. It often overcommits RAM, promising more to apps than it actually has. When the system truly runs out, the OOM killer is triggered. It calculates a badness score for every process based on how much RAM it is using and how essential it is to the system. The goal is to kill the biggest hog that isn't essential. If your Minecraft server or Chrome tab suddenly vanishes, the OOM killer just did a welfare check on your RAM. A TTY was originally a physical piece of hardware, a typewriter connected to a mainframe. Today, when you press Ctrl-Alt-F3, you access a software virtual console. However, when you open an app like Terminal in GNOME, you are using a PTY, or pseudo-terminal. The shell is just the program that interprets your text. So, the terminal emulator is the window, the PTY is the wire, and the shell is the brain. You're essentially using a modern simulation of 1970s hardware to run 2020s software. When a process wants to talk to the world, the kernel gives it a file descriptor, an integer. By default, every process starts with 3, 0 for standard input, 1 for standard output, and 2 for standard error. If the app opens a database connection, that might be FD3. If it opens a log file, that's FD4. Because everything is a file, Linux doesn't care if FD4 is a file on disk or a socket talking to a server in Iceland. You can see these in real time by looking in the proc directory. Encryption requires truly random numbers, but computers are logical and predictable. To get randomness, the Linux kernel harvests entropy from the physical world, the timing between your keystrokes, atmospheric noise from your Wi-Fi card, or mouse jitters. This entropy is stored in a pool. Devrandom is the modern standard. It uses a cryptographic generator to provide limitless random data. The older devrandom is more pure, but will actually block and pause your code if the entropy pool runs dry, waiting for you to move your mouse to generate more chaos. Linux handles process death like a bureaucracy. When a child process dies, it doesn't disappear immediately. It enters a zombie state. It stays there until the parent process acknowledges its death code. If the parent is buggy and never acknowledges it, the zombie stays in your process table forever. You can't kill a zombie because it's already dead. An orphan is different. It's a child whose parent died first. In this case, system adopts the orphan to make sure it's cleaned up properly when it finally finishes its work. The three numbers in uptime are often misunderstood. They aren't CPU usage percentages. They represent the system load. Think of a bridge with 4 lanes. A load of 2.0 means the bridge is half full. A load of 4.0 means the bridge is perfectly full. A load of 10.0 means the bridge is full and there are 6 cars waiting in line. Load average tracks processes that are either using the CPU or waiting for uninterruptible tasks like disk I/O. If your load is high but CPU usage is low, your hard drive is likely the bottleneck. If the kernel is the engine of the car, eBPF is like being able to change the spark plugs while the car is driving at 80 miles per hour. Traditionally, if you wanted to change how the Linux kernel handled networking or security, you had to write a kernel module and risk crashing the entire system. eBPF allows you to run sandboxed programs inside the kernel without restarting or risking a crash. It is often called JavaScript for the kernel. It's the secret behind modern high-performance networking and observability tools, allowing developers to hook into any system call or network packet with zero overhead. Linux hates wasted RAM, so it uses every spare byte as a page cache. When you read a file, Linux keeps it in RAM just in case you need it again. This makes the second read nearly instantaneous. More importantly, when you write a file, Linux doesn't actually write it to the disk immediately. It marks the memory as a dirty page and tells your app the job is done. This creates the illusion of incredible speed. However, if the power cuts out before those dirty pages are flushed to the disk, that data is gone forever. This is why you should always use the sync command before pulling out a USB drive. That is 8 minutes of Linux chaos, condensed into one high-speed briefing. If you understood even half of this, you're already ahead of 90% of the people calling themselves power users. Go forth, break your system, and remember, if all else fails, just blame System D.